Chapter 49. Theo Makes It Weird. Antony's POV. As Bunta stalked away, Antony felt his shoulders stiffen. He had barely been up for an hour, and already he was feeling weary and persecuted. That was a ridiculous way to feel when the only problems he had had were encountering people who reminded him of his own bad behavior. If he didn't want to feel guilty and harried, he should have been more considerate. He had no right to feel as downtrodden as he did. What good was it living for 1,000 years if you never learned how to reason yourself out of irrational emotions? Sorry, Theodora offered after Bunta was gone, though she didn't sound terribly sincere. Zenji is his lover, and he's been a bit rattled by having your last attendant working in the kitchens with him. A sigh pushed out of Antony's lungs. And then I came and interrupted a nap that I'm sure he begged and threatened you to take. I don't know how long I would have stayed there anyway, Theodora said, collapsing into the chair and looking down at Chihiro where he slept. I don't like to leave him. That might be a problem. Theo, there's something I need to ask you. She cast him a wary look, but raised an eyebrow in as much of an invitation to speak as he was likely to get. Antony took a deep breath and relaxed his face, banishing the scowl that was trying to creep over him. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest. I haven't had any luck trying to feed normally from Hanyu. His voice was tight and too level, he knew that, but it was the only way to keep from snarling the words. I think I need to know that someone is there to stop me if I try to take too much from him. Would you be willing to do that? Theo looked from Antony to Hanyu, who was blushing and shuffling his feet. Hadn't the boy had years of deportment lessons? Theodora's eyebrows crept slowly up her face. Antony, she said at last, please promise me this isn't a sex thing. Antony felt his jaw sag open. Hanyu squawked, then slapped his hand over his mouth and glanced guiltily at Chihiro, who slumbered on. The boy had turned bright red, and Antony was grateful for the dark coloring that hid his own embarrassment. What the hell, Theo? He ground out. She shrugged. Sorry, it just seems like something very intense is happening with you two, and now you want me to watch while you penetrate him and suck him and... Theo! Now Antony was the one squawking. Chihiro shifted a little on the bed, making his sheets rustle, and Antony shut himself up. He closed his eyes and took a few breaths. It might not be a physical necessity anymore, but it was a good way to take a few moments to center himself and settle himself down. When he opened his eyes again, Theo was still regarding him with flat mistrust, and Hanyu was staring resolutely at the floor. The boy's hands were worrying at each other, and his whole body was swaying like a dancer's as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other over and over again. His blush had not contented itself with his face, spreading down his neck and over his ears. Theo, Antony said as calmly as he could manage, it's just eating. It's not sexual when you feed from any of your men, is it? She shook her head. No, but it's still very intimate. It's not like we're popping some bread in our mouths, after all. There's a lot of close touching, and I've always found it very personal. That doesn't make it a sex thing just because I like men. All right, sorry. I just get a much more intense feeling from you two. I'm sorry about your feelings, but I need to eat, Antony snapped. I'm not interested in starving to death because you're afraid I've developed some kind of exhibitionist food kink that you don't want to be a part of. But when he came to us the other day and drank from Kenta, you got so flustered when I tried to ask you about it. I thought it must be some kind of fetish or... Gods, no, Antony yelped. I don't want to hurt him, all right? Is that so fucking strange? When I try to drink, I get scared that I'll hurt him, and I need you there to make sure I don't. Theo's eyes went wide, then soft. Antony hated watching her understand, hated the moment her suspicion turned to pity. He hated how naked he was before her, but then that was why she was the one he had thought to approach. It was impossible to be more visible and vulnerable to her than he already was. His thoughts were interrupted by a snicker from Hanyu. Sorry, my lords, the boy said, when they both turned to look at him. It was just funny hearing you say gods, swearing by yourself. I guess I don't have to feel bad about doing it anymore. Hanyu grinned then, and Antony felt everything in him relax. His tangled-up feelings about approaching Theo for help, his defensiveness, his fear, all of his knots loosened under that sweet, unabashed smile. He felt his shoulders slump and let his arms slip down to his sides. Don't be ridiculous, boy, he grumbled. Why would we care how you swear? Hanyu beamed even brighter, then turned to look earnestly at Theodora. It's my fault, my lord. I was tired and slumped over on him when he was feeding one night, and you know how kind he is, so you understand why that upset him. He's been worried about hurting me ever since. Theo smiled. He does tend to fret. Yes, but it's sweet, Hanyu said defensively. He takes such good care of me. That's a nice way of saying he pesters the life out of you, Theo replied, and Antony looked from one to the other of them in betrayal. I'm standing right here, he protested. They both laughed. Antony stared at them, aghast. There was something very intimidating about the idea of his best friend and his Hanyu united, talking about him, teasing him. At the same time, it was nice to see them smiling and laughing together. Antony relaxed a little and shook off the tension that had filled him under Theo's sympathetic gaze. There was even something sweet and safe about his apprehension. These two might know too much about his soft places, but that was as close to all right as such vulnerability could ever be. They wouldn't use that knowledge to hurt him. All right, yes, you're both very funny. He rolled his eyes theatrically. So, do I get to eat, or are you going to point and laugh while I shrivel to nothing in front of you? All right, Theo nodded. If that's what you need me for, I'll watch. First hint that you're taking too much, I'll rip your arm off. Good enough? Antony flinched. Maybe we could start a little milder than that? Suit yourself. Theo levered out of her chair and gestured to Hanyu. You better sit down. Hanyu obeyed, but Antony cleared his throat. I thought perhaps my rooms would be a bit more private. I'm not leaving. Sorry. Theo didn't sound terribly sorry. If you want me present, it'll have to happen here. What if he wakes up? Antony hissed, gesturing to Chihiro's sleeping form. He regretted his question as soon as Theo's eyes started filling with tears. He hasn't woken at all today, except when I made him take some water and broth. I doubt that you would rouse him. Still, Hanyu hadn't said much up to this point. He still seemed shy of Theodora, but his voice was strong with concern. Would it frighten him to see the feeding, like when I asked about punishment? I doubt it, Theo said. He had plenty of experience with punishments back at that damn temple, but he's never had an upsetting feeding. You're sweet to worry, though, Hanyu. Hanyu mumbled unintelligibly and subsided into his chair. He glanced up at Antony and then down, shyer than he had been since, perhaps ever. Antony understood the hesitation. Theo's mentions of penetration and sucking were still rattling around in his head, too. Damn it. Hanyu lowered his lashes, hiding his eyes from Antony. At the same time, however, he lifted his chin to offer his throat. Please, my lord, the boy said softly. You must be so hungry. He was. Antony's belly felt cavernous and echoing, and the sight of Hanyu's submissively yielded throat had him swallowing convulsively. But his very hunger sent trepidation snaking cold and menacing through him, and he found himself taking a step back. Easy, Antony. Theo's voice wasn't cloying and soothing, but matter-of-fact. I've got you. I won't let anything happen. Antony was not trustworthy. Theodora was. He bent over Hanyu and leaned in close, so close he could smell the breakfast spices lingering on his attendant's quick, shallow breaths. Rosemary, he thought, though it had been so long he would be surprised if he were right. He leaned closer, ghosted his lips over the boy's hot flesh, pulled back. Theo, he croaked, would you please keep a hand on my shoulder or head or somewhere? It wasn't enough to know intellectually that she was there. He needed to feel her readiness to save Hanyu from him. Sure enough, once her big calloused hand was gripping the back of his neck, Antony felt himself relax. The tight knots he'd made of his shoulders loosened, and for the first time in almost 2 weeks he sank his fangs into his offering. He groaned as Hanyu's blood filled his mouth. It was just as good as he'd remembered. Better, the best there had ever been. He couldn't hold back his gratification as it slid thick and hot down his parched throat. His noise was lost in the low, ecstatic moan that dripped from Hanyu's mouth. The boy's voice quivered with pleasure, vibrating against Antony's lips as he took a second eager swallow, then another. Antony pulled away after the third mouthful, feeling a great swell of relief. He hadn't lost himself in the moment. Theo hadn't even had to give him a warning squeeze. There was Hanyu, alive and hearty, leaning back against the chair with his chest heaving and his pupils blown wide. And there was Theo, glowering at both of them with her free hand on her hip. The other hand, still resting on Antony's neck, suddenly felt a lot more threatening than it had a moment ago. Her huff drew Hanyu's languid gaze as well. Noises like that, and you still expect me to believe this isn't a sex thing? Hanyu's eyes went wide in earnest. It isn't for him, just me. Antony could only manage a croak before Theodora released a burst of shocked laughter. She muffled it quickly behind her hands, probably to keep from waking Chihiro, but she kept shaking and gasping nonetheless. Antony turned his scowl on her because he didn't know how to look at Hanyu. Even after she calmed herself and sent them on their way, he avoided Hanyu's gaze all the way back to their rooms.